the promised child was born back in Genesis 21. It seemed to be the end of Abraham's journey of faith. Now we come to Genesis 22, where Abraham encounters perhaps the most dramatic crisis of his faith when God says to him, "Take your son, your only son, the son whom you love, take him to Mount Moriah and offer him as a sacrifice to me." Notice the language here. It's not just take Isaac, it's not just take your son, but take your son, your only son, and need I remind you, the son whom you love. What a tremendous test of Abraham's faith, and the reader may be relieved right from the start, since verse 1 tells us it was a test of his faith. But Abraham doesn't know that as of yet. So how will he respond? How will he respond to this command, this instruction to take him to Mount Moriah in order to offer him as a sacrifice? Well, the text doesn't tell us what went through his mind that night. It simply reports that the next day he gets up, he gets Isaac, he brings the materials he needs for the fire, and he starts the journey along with his servants to Mount Moriah. And in other words, the text, by the way it narrates the event, emphasizes Abraham's utter obedience to God's command, his fearful command, his astounding command to take his son to offer him as a sacrifice. In other words, we're learning that Abraham has now come to utterly trust God. Now, there are little signals within the text that indicate to us that Abraham is hopeful that he won't have to follow through on the act. For instance, when they arrive at Mount Moriah, he says to the two servants, "We're going to go up and offer this sacrifice, and then we will be right back." Or as they're going up the mountain, Isaac turns to his father and says, "We have the fire, and we have the kindling, but where's the animal?" And he says, "God will provide." Now, I think that we're to read that again as Abraham's hope that God will stay his hand. But even so, Abraham is trusting God to the point that he will carry out the act. And as he raises the knife, God does stay his hand, tell him, "Don't sacrifice Isaac," and he provides a substitute animal as the sacrifice. Now, very significantly, not just for the story, but for New Testament theology, the angel who appears to Abraham says, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all the nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me." That's verses 15 to 18. The significance of this speech is that God is now telling Abraham that he will fulfill all the promises that he had given him, quote, "because you have obeyed me." This passage is going to take us to the New Testament, specifically to James chapter 2, verse 14 through 21. where James says, "What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, keep warm and well fed,' but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it's not accompanied by action, is dead. But someone will say, 'You have faith, I have deeds. Show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by my deeds.' You believe there is one God. Good, even the demons believe that and shudder. You foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did, and the scripture was fulfilled that says, 'Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And he was called God's friend.' You see that a person is considered righteous by what they do and not by faith alone." Of course, Genesis 22 and James's use of it raises the whole issue of faith and works. And some people get very worried about what James says here and believe it threatens the doctrine of justification by faith alone, but not at all. Not at all. God is not saying that he is fulfilling his promises because of Abraham's obedience, and James isn't denying the doctrine of justification by faith alone. He's just saying that one's works, one's deeds demonstrates the faith that saves us. And so they're both making the case that faith naturally disposes itself or expresses itself in our actions. It isn't as if all of a sudden somebody becomes a Christian and they become Mother Teresa, but if our faith doesn't affect our actions in some way, then as James says, our faith without works is dead. The story of Abraham and the binding of Isaac is a lesson about the fact that faith expresses itself in good works, in obedience to God. We're not saved by our works. We're saved by Jesus, but our faith will express itself in our good actions. Before we leave Genesis 22, let me make a comment about the location of this episode, namely Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is only mentioned one other place in Scripture, but a very significant place in 2 Chronicles 3, verse 1, as the location of the temple. Solomon will build the temple on Mount Moriah. Now, of course, its more famous name, or perhaps it's the name of a peak in a range known as Moriah, was Zion. But it's, of course, significant that this event, the offering of Isaac by Abraham, took place on the location of the future temple. And then finally, think about it. And the early church fathers talked a lot about it. That is that the offering of Abraham's only son, his very loved son, is evocative of the future offering of God's only begotten son, Jesus. Whereas God stayed Abraham's hand and Isaac wasn't sacrificed, Jesus freely offered himself up on behalf of our sins. So a Christian can't read Genesis 22 without thinking of this great sacrifice that God made for our redemption.